All right, we got a special episode here today. We got Coach Mike Boyle on. Thank you for being on. You reached out, want to talk a little bit more about this of assembly line versus rack base. So, what spawned that? Like, hey, let's talk a little bit more about this on your end.
Well, really enjoy listening to your episodes because they're really thoughtful. So I had listened to sort of want versus need, and then I listened to the rack based one. And as I'm listening to the rack based one, I was thinking, oh, I don't know if I agree. I know that I don't agree
Yep.
because we're we're quote unquote assembly line, and we've been assembly line for forever. But the assembly line really came out of, I guess, what would really be now the small college, mid-major kind of college market, and trying to figure out how do we process. I think when I started at BU, I never actually did the numbers, but I would say it was probably 500 athletes and me, and maybe at that time, 1 GA. And it was always about scheduling. And that's the thing I like. I appreciate what you're always talking about, the fact it's really all logistics, right? And looking and saying, how do I get today? I've got to get, let's just say, 6, 7, 8 teams through here. And I always felt like if I don't assembly line them, or we would call it kind of waterfall them. So we bring in a group every 15 minutes and then work them through the room. So what we kind of end up with is something that's probably in between your rack based idea and the assembly line, because I would call it a rack based assembly line in the
Mm,
sense that we have, we always look at it and say, okay, what's our rack exercise today? Kind of your big rate limiter is going to be what you'll use the rack for that day. And then everything else gets built around that. And for us, we kind of had what we would look at as platforms, racks, and then assistants. And you kind of you made up your assistant stuff based on, all right, I'll get my explosive stuff done on the platforms, and then I'll figure out what the rack exercise is for that day. And for us, it was one of those things where, hey, it's either bench press or squats, because it can't be bench press and squats because we only got 8 racks. And so we would do whatever the rack based exercise was for that day. And then in that kind of third block of the room, we would do whatever the assistance work was. And we started to get really good at figuring out, okay, what assistance work can we do that doesn't require the rack? And so I think sometimes that's, what we would look at now as our system was really born out of figuring out how do I create this assembly line in college so that men's and women's tennis can work out and soccer can work out. I mean, we were even at the point, I remember when I was a college strength coach, I just said no to rowing. I was like, I can't take crew. They have too many kids. I can't do it. And we had a very tiered system in terms of football was always kind of, or wanted to be the top dog. And they were the top dog because they had the most players. This was when Boston University had football. So back in the 90s. But the reality was hockey was our best sport and men's basketball was our second best sport. So we had to look at that and see, how do we keep the hockey coach happy? How do we keep the men's basketball coach happy? And how do we keep the football coach happy? And how do we take, if we start with that group and say, so that group's 140, how do we keep those 140 people doing what we think they need to do and then accommodate another 300 in terms of, at that time, field hockey, women's basketball, men's and women's. Actually, then, interesting, it was just men's soccer. Women's soccer started right about the time I left. But so assembly lines seem to be the only way. Sorry, and I'm doing a lot of talking, and
no,
I'll
no, it's good because one thing I actually want to ask you a question on because you talk about this in designing strength training's book. The idea of the first one was full rack, so you can pair up front squat and pull ups. As you started to, all right, this is the way we do it. Going to a half rack or any other like equipment that you're like, we just had a wholesale 180 on. Like, we don't do that anymore because I don't need to pair front squat and pull up anymore because I have a row paired up with my lower body push. Was there any like equipment things or you're like, oh, now that I'm going this kind of waterfall effect that you're like, okay, we can abandon this notion if it's full rack and nothing? Was there any epiphanies that you had?
one of the big epiphanies was the connected rack idea. And I don't know if Perform Better was the first one to do that. They were the first ones I saw that had the connector in between that would allow you to get a pull-up bar in between. And suddenly once I realized, okay, I because the reason we didn't in the beginning, if you read the first version of that book, I said, don't buy half racks. because you can't pair half racks and chin ups. If you want to do chin ups, you've got to have a full rack and you've got to squat inside the rack and you've got to do your chin up on, with your bar outside on the front side of that rack. And that was always how we set up. When the connectors came in, well, there were two things. One, the connectors came in, and two, we started to do less squatting.
Mhm.
And then we started to do no squatting really. So, and even then there was a time when we were back split squatting. So kind of like people like the Hatfield squat now, we were just sort of back rear foot elevated split squat was kind of our bread and butter exercise there. And then you'll appreciate this because we had the Murphy's Law moment
Mm.
where we had a guy in, full rack, guys inside the rack. He's doing a rear foot elevated split squat. And suddenly he can't complete the lift. And he decides in his infinite wisdom that the way to get up is to take his hands off the bar and to grab the side rails of the
Yep.
rack.
Mhm.
And I am looking at this kid who was at that time a first round draft pick with 280 pounds that he's now like balancing on his neck. So he's holding the sides of the rack and he's got 280 pounds teetering up on his neck. And he's trying to figure out how he gets himself out of the hole. And I'm screaming, to guys, trying to get guys to grab the bar. And all I'm envisioning, honestly, is fingers
Yeah.
on the floor
Yeah.
because he's gonna tip that bar off, and somehow Murphy's Law is really gonna manifest itself, and it's gonna land on his fingers, and he's gonna get 280 pounds on these outstretched hands, and career ending. I'm on the floor, trying to put fingers in ice bags. Like these are all the things that are going through my head.
Yeah.
And I swore, I said, I'm never doing that again. I'm never going to have a guy. Because 2 legs, you bail, right? You missed a squat. You end up, if you got the pins in the right place, you're in the right spot. And I have no idea whatever prompted this guy to think I'll let go of the bar and grab the side rails anyway. But it just made me, and I use this example all the time with people, the things that you think will never happen in a weight room will absolutely, positively happen.
Yeah.
And generally, it will be the most dangerous thing that could occur. And you look and think, wow, I mean, again, guys, and obviously the USC thing, guy dropping a bar on their neck, there's so many things that could happen. And you realize, okay, that's why we're not going to false grip bench. We're not going to let
Mhm.
guys false grip because all of a sudden somebody decides he wants to bounce one more rep with the false grip and he manages to bounce it out of his hands. And we had a kid do that one time, but luckily just got it in the chest, which
Yeah.
still wasn't good. You get
Yeah.
320 pounds hard in the chest, but
Well, well, that's a really good segue because it just goes into your psyche, it's in your subconscious. You're not thinking about like that's even an option anymore. You bring in a whole host of young coaches who've never gone through these traumatic experiences as a strength coach, and that feeling of I got to call their parents and tell them your son or daughter lost their finger today because of just bad logistics or something that we didn't really think out well enough. And we're talking about the potential risk associated with what could be the worst possible scenario on this, and then reverse engineer if there's a simple, easier, less risky way to getting the job done. But that process of, okay, now it's embedded into your just DNA of, I'm never doing that again. And you don't think about it actively. Then you get a insurgence of a young group of coaches coming in who've never experienced that. What is that process for you when you're trying to go through? This is the way we organize training to get a high volume of people through, get great training, but like get into that like thing that it's not top of mind for young coaches to like associate risk with the things they're asked to do, or a lot of paying clients. Like they just don't rationalize the risk associated with things we're asking them to do. And like it comes out with exercise selection too, a ton with like, I was told I could need a back squat or deadlift. And like, and there's a risk with everything. And a lot of times our young coaches or clients just don't really associate with that. So that process for you when you're getting to that critical juncture of, do I explain this to a point where it's telling me stories, or is it, hey, this is the system because we just had great success with it and just follow on port. And if you get to a certain tenure here and you want to have a conversation with it, what's that process for you with your staff?
well, there's 2 venues. One is tell the story because I think the stories are really powerful, and I've told that story a number of times. And I have to tell the stories more often because Coach Parker, our hockey coach at BU, who I'm probably his biggest fan, but he's the winningest coach in one sport at one school in NCAA history. He won almost 900 games, all of them at Boston University, never coached anyplace else. But he would always say in team meetings, I know I've said this 100 times, but I might not have said it to this group. And I realize as the staff turns over, sometimes I think, well, everybody knows why I think this.
Mhm.
And then I realize I'll have that question. Raise your hand if you were here last time we talked about this. And if we've got 25 staff people, 4 people raise their hand. And I think, wow, I haven't, we haven't told this story, because sometimes you feel like, oh my God, I'm that old guy. And everybody's like, oh, I've heard all the stories. And here he's going to tell the one about why we don't back split squat anymore.
Mhm.
But then you realize it's actually the opposite. It's kind of like when people talk about advertising on social media and people say you should do it every day because not enough people are clicking.
Yeah.
It's the same thing in coaching. You probably realize they can't hear it enough. That's one thing. The other thing I say, and this is always in our summer intern meeting, because we bring in a really large number of interns in the summer, I always say to them, the 2 words I don't want to hear are "I thought." Because when you come to me, if you have to come to me and have a conversation where you say, Mike, I thought, I said, you are apologizing, and you're probably apologizing because someone got hurt or something got broken, or someone got hurt and something got broken. But it will usually be because you thought about doing something differently than what we told you to do. So I want you to understand, and I always try to tell everybody, there is a reason. There is a really solid reason why we do everything that we do. You're more than welcome to ask, okay, what's the reason for that? And I will try my best to explain it to you. But then sometimes I always say, and I've had this conversation a lot with Anthony on our podcast, sometimes for me, the reason is just like for me, like I said, the American football trap, right? My hockey lens. Sometimes my hockey lens lends me to go down a certain route. And I don't think about that and realize, oh, that maybe that's just because I've been working with hockey for the last 30 years, more so than American football. So I haven't had American football since in large volume since 1996 or 7, right? So it's been almost 30 years. And I've had hockey the whole time. So like for us, people say, like, we don't crawl. We never crawl. And people say, why don't you crawl? And I'm like, because hockey guys are always complaining about their wrists. And when we started, doing inchworms and bear crawls and stuff like that, I would have half the team either trying to crawl in their knuckles or looking at me and saying, I can't do this. And I got to a point where I said, we just don't crawl. And then, crawling got to be really big, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Everybody was crawling. And everybody looked at me and said, well, why don't we crawl? And I'm like, well, we don't crawl because I've done tons of hockey, and the hockey people don't like crawling. It's not good for their wrists. And I kind of realized that, and we could do it in our adult program. It's probably not going to be a big deal, but I'm seeing everything through my kind of tinted hockey lens that makes me think a certain way. And that's why I said to you before we got on the air, that's the American football trap. I think most strength coaches see everything. And that's like when you were talking about rack based, I think everybody sees it through the American football lens, because the example that you gave is the guy who's worried about, he's not going to get enough time. He's going to get rushed. He's going to do this. And you realize, yeah, we're programming now for 1 or 2 or 4 or 5 guys, whatever it is, and not really programming for the group. Because when you really look at that guy, and I remember you said this, I re-listened to the podcast today because you were saying, hey, for me, this is kind of my space. I'm good at the strength training part. This is how I contribute to the good of the program. You don't want me looking at you and saying, and by the way, Tim, you got 12 minutes to clean.
Yeah.
And so that means, it's like we've had to think of things that I've even talked about. We get really good at warming up. Like one of the things that used to get us was trap bar deadlift. We'd trap bar deadlift. If I had a guy who was going to do 4 or 5 for 5, he's got to do at least 4 sets before he gets to his first work set. And if we did that in the conventional manner, that would be tough to do in 12 minutes. And realistically, we have 12 minutes per block. That's the way our system works out. So what we started doing is I'd say to everybody, set up a 135 warm-up, set a 225 warm-up, set up a 315 warm-up. And I would just let the guys go, just go down the trap bar row. Bang out 5 at 135, and then bang out 2 or 3 at 225, and then bang out a couple at 315. All right, now you're ready to warm up. I got a bar over there loaded at 405. So my group we'd have 4 trap bars going, but instead of 3 guys to a bar, we had 8 guys to 4 bars, but we weren't changing plates.
Yeah.
We were
Yeah.
literally just working our way down. And
Mhm.
that's one of the reasons I like trap bar better than squat anyway, but I like it better for that reason, because Now I can get a really good, heavy multi-joint exercise, and I don't have the rack problem.
Yeah.
In fact, my rack, like, I can pair bench and trap bar deadlift if I got a 2-day program or a 3-day program, and that works out really, really well.
Now,
Whereas squatting, squatting and benching, if you have a rack-based system, you're always competing, like, what's more important?
yeah. Do you find now, as like you've been doing this style of programming since the 90s, do you find that there's been some big gaps or blind spots with this style? Is it a time component thing or is it an exercise selection thing?
I think the biggest gap probably is that time component thing and that strong guy
Okay.
who honestly, the strong guy, I think, again, it's one of those situations. If I was doing American football again, I think we would have to modify our system. Like, I might have 2 sets of racks,
Yeah.
and I might have a situation where, I had 2 rows of racks, and your strong guy might be in block 1, he might be warming up,
Mhm.
and then in block 2, he might actually move back 1 rack, which would really fuck with his mind in some ways because, like,
Yeah.
I can't switch racks, and you're like, "Yes, you," that's what I tried to get my guys to understand. Yes, you can.
Yeah.
One of the best things that ever happened was I had a scout years ago when we very first did this, and we couldn't find a place to run a 40, and he looked in the hockey rink, and he was like, "The hallway's way longer than 60 yards." He said, "We'll run it in here," and I looked at him, and I said, "It's like it's a painted floor. It's just painted cement." And the guy was like, "Fast people are fast, and they are fast anywhere." He said, "I will make a note that we ran it in the hockey rink hallway, but this is all we got that's 40 yards long. I want a 40-yard time on this guy."
Mhm.
And that time, our Bill Brooks, who was one of our first great players at BU, he ran like a 4.5 in the hockey hallway, and it was like, "Okay, here we go." Um, so I think some of it is getting guys to be a little bit more adaptable and not letting, hey, the inmates run the asylum, the meathead to dictate, "Hey, we have to do this," because it's the same way with warm-ups. You look at some guys who they wanna warm up, and they wanna sit down, and they wanna take time, and it's like, "Hey, sorry, we
Yeah.
don't we don't have that time. This block lasts this long, and you better get used to it." And the great thing I found, guys are incredibly adaptable and can do just about anything you ask them to do, but they also will be as set in their ways as you possibly allow them to be. So I think that's the logistics, and you had the ultimate situation. Army, I don't think there's a better place to be a strength coach than a service academy.
Yeah.
At least I've never been one, but I would think that that would just be so easy because you've got guys, they used to taking orders. This is their lifestyle. Whereas you go to the standard kind of Division I football program, and you probably have literally almost the polar opposite in
Yeah. Yeah.
terms of
I'll be honest, Mike, that was actually a big issue for me. It became, and you hate to say this out loud, but it became really easy. Like anything you say they were gonna do as hard as humanly possible, and there was no conflict. There was no like, "Oh, wow, I'm gonna really have to find the perfect story or the metaphor to get these guys to believe in what I'm telling them." It was like, "We're doing this," and they just go do it. And there was that, like, I guess, air of, like, I don't know, disappointment. Like, "Oh, man, I wish it was a little bit more of, like, a blowback," where in hindsight, yeah, it was a great place, and I think I was just in that perfect setting where you could really challenge yourself, and I found the response from me was just getting incredibly creative and pushing boundaries, finding, like, these, like, avenues where I can express myself, and maybe I'm not trying to poke the bear intentionally, but I'm trying to see, like, hey, at what point they're gonna say, "This is getting a little too fringe and weird," or is they're just gonna be compliant with everything, and I never hit it. You just never hit it. But to what you were talking about in terms of these like time constraints, that's probably the hardest part about a military academy is it's about as aggressive a time constraint as you could possibly imagine in a college sector. And there's no like I can just skip my class or I can skip formation. You got to block a time and they're done when they're done and there's no debate about it. They got to be in the next thing at a very regimented pace. So you got to be extremely diligent and organized from the flow and the way you're structuring things and having these like blocks allocated. Like, hey, if movement prep is taking longer than 15 minutes, it could eat into the training session and it's going to be a definitive stop. So what's the more important thing here? I'd rather cut the movement prep short because we're overly explaining or doing something like go back, do it right, that kind of thing. And when we're going to get to the big ROI stuff in the weight room or on the field doing speed or plyometrics, we got to spend our time there. Like we just got to be very cognizant of this window. If it's deviated anyway, it's stopping here so we don't miss out on that.
Right. And that's us anyway. That's what's interesting about our business because because now we are private sector, we can't run our business in any other way.
Yeah.
And we tell everybody that, again, that's a big part of our summer training. You have to be on time. If you're off, we show them. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but there's a great I Love Lucy episode. You may be too young. But I show up at every meeting where they're working the candy assembly line and they're supposed to be wrapping candy. And Ethel and Lucy are talking, and they can't wrap the candy fast enough. So at one point, they're eating candy, and then their mouth gets full, and then they start putting candy down on the ground underneath them because they can't keep up with the conveyor belt. And I show everybody, hey, this is what happens when you don't respect when we say 12 minutes. Like, you got 12 minutes.
Yeah.
And we tell everybody now, you're done at the end of 12 minutes. And if you're the other coach, because the other thing that we do differently, like you were saying, somebody would maybe just run warm up and then waterfall people through. We send the coach through with the group so that they don't get bored. Because I think that does become an issue if somebody, hey, I'm the warm up guy today.
Mhm.
It's going to be really hard to not have somebody mailing in warm ups by the 15th or 18th warm up group that comes through.
Yeah.
So you always flow through with your group, but you also know when to look at the person. We always tell them, look behind you, look in front of you all the time. You need to know, is the person behind, do they have some strong kids? Are they struggling on the platforms? Are they not done with their set yet? Do I need to try to figure out, all right, how do I make up a minute or 2 minutes so that these guys can get their last set in? Because it is, but I think that's like good college strength and conditioning is a logistical challenge.
Yeah.
But a lot of us have lost that logistical ability because we get the one team thing. I had one of our female coaches tell me she turned down a job because she said, I'm going to have to take 4 or 5 teams if I go to this school. And I kind of looked and thought, really, that's your issue? She said, yeah, I'm good with like 2 or 3 teams is fine, but 4 or 5 is a lot. And I'm the old guy that walked uphill to school both ways at this stage because I had a time where I had football, basketball, men's hockey, women's basketball, women's field hockey. I didn't even know. Like I think we had 20 some odd teams that were regular weight room users, and they were all my teams because I didn't have anybody else. And if I had an intern or a GA, I would never think, I'll give them these teams. We coached everybody all the time, and we got really good at processing. Maybe we may have lost. Oh, you're back. Good. We had a little lost connection. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know how much we lost, but we lost a little.
So you got through the intern and then these teams.
Yeah, I said I would never give an intern these teams. I would never think, I've got a kid who's interning, and now suddenly I'm going to give him 3 or 4 teams.
Mm.
We coached every team all day, and we did. Luckily for me, I was smart early on in terms of I had the weight room open 7 hours a day. I opened it from 12 to 7, and we had teams probably starting at 1. We'd get some in-season teams who were going to get in before practice, and the last team would go 6 to 7, and we would do that 5 days a week, all the time. And the good thing was it allowed me to have another job in the morning. Like I could work for the Bruins or do whatever other things I was doing.
Yeah.
But I also never ended up being that 6 to 6 strength coach who was miserable because they were getting there at 6 in the morning and they were still there at 6 o'clock at night.
Yeah. There's a lot of like guarding your desk in some college setting. One question I had, Mike, and this is something I think a lot about with the waterfall effect. And especially with young coaches, there's a shepherd effect of getting them from one station to the next. Do you ever have kids who get lost in that transition or don't get to the next station in an efficient enough manner, and that eats into the maybe a B block or a C block? And how do you manage that?
Again, part of it, I think it's always coach education. I think, interestingly enough, and I know you're a big reader because you're always alluding to books that you read, but my favorite book or one of my favorite books was The One Thing. And Brandon Marcello, if you know Brandon, but
Mhm.
Brandon said, "You gotta read The One Thing," and I remember reading The One Thing, and in my mind, cursing Brandon the whole time, like, "Fucking Brandon, like, he's one thing, this is so stupid," and you you get to the end of the book, and the task at the end of the book is to establish the one thing that by doing it would make everything else easier, and I realized that that was coach education. So for me, the one thing that would make everything else easier was me doing a better job of educating the people that were working with me. And you again, I go right back to listening to your podcast, but like you said, I was like the rack one coach. Like that was me, that was my identity. I did that. But you look at that and think, as that rack one coach, you're impacting maybe 20 guys a day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what you really want to be impacting, if you've got 100 roster guys, you want to be impacting 100 roster guys. And to do that, you have to let go of being the rack one coach and
Mhm.
realize that, like for me, I always say, I'm everybody's assistant.
Yeah.
And sometimes people who don't, when people come in who don't know me, they look around and kind of like, who's the lost little old man wandering around the
Mhm.
place?
Yeah.
And then they realize they're like, oh, that's Mike Boyle. Like, look, he does great. Doesn't even look like he's doing anything. And most of the time I'm not,
Mhm.
but I am in terms of I'm observing everything that's going on and I'm making sure that the line is moving, that the way it's supposed to be moving and the coaches are doing what they're supposed to be doing because I realized that for me, the exponential effect is in coach education. Even in doing stuff like this, when people say, why are you on Twitter? Why are you doing podcasts? Because that's the exponential effect of coach education. I can affect way more people being on your podcast, probably than I can by writing a book, honestly.
Yeah.
The way education is consumed now.
It, it,
And
it's really interesting you mentioned though the Rack One identity, and this actually just came up recently. A former assistant was like, I really took a lot of stock in that, and the thesis behind it was in football, we're going to win and lose games with our front seven, and if we're going to have a concentric circle on the program and impacting wins and losses, was I got to put my time and energy with the thing that has the most upside or most tangible improvement. And if I got a really highly developed, skilled athlete that's trying to take their 40 from a 4.5 to 4.4, it's a drop in the bucket and it's marginal. But if I got a 240-pound offensive lineman, I can get him 60 pounds. Or if I got a kid who's just really weak and I can improve his strength tangibly, like that's going to have a big impact on it. But what that comes is like very small, closed circle of influence that you have, like the concentric circle that you potentially have on the entire program becomes limited. And where I made when I became a business owner, that I had to abandon that completely, right? The notion of like my sphere of influence needs to be more broad and work through these like more of a team of teams type of approach. If we have these like gyms and clusters of the gyms and these little microcosms that we're working through and influencing on. And I was like, oh wow, okay. I just immediately evolved. Like as soon as I saw I can't have this like small concentric circle, then I have to abandon that. But the conversation I was having with a former assistant kind of burned him, and it led to a situation where the rest of the team felt alienated, and that was a complaint to the coach and led to ultimately that position being terminated. And I was like, oh wow, okay, that's a good lesson of the that was just a situation where the kids that I was not necessarily spending a lot of time with had a great coach, or maybe didn't feel less than. Maybe I figured out a way to cross that chasm of like not having a direct influence on them. But with that being said, is the notion of when you're doing a assembly line or waterfall, or you have 100 teams and you're just trying to like have an influence on all of them and quality control it all, that you got to be have some checks and balances of saying, all right, there's some stuff that kids don't, one, feel like I'm having an influence on them, or two, our coaches don't feel like they have the support necessary to do their job and giving enough feedback. And the in a college weight room, it turns into like rack one is its own individual entity, and then rack 14 is this whole separate thing. And that could be just bottoming them out. And the quality of that training could be there because the coach feels neglected, the kids feel neglected, and you don't know it. You're just kind of running blind. And that process too of like coming back full circle, now having 3 gyms and I have 6 racks per gym and I have 30 total coaches, like every single one of those people I have to have some sort of connection to make sure every single day we're doing the job that we need to be doing. But that feeling of, all right, I'm no longer rack one coach anymore. I'm every man's coach. I'm like everyone's assistant, like you said, is a necessary evolution.
it really is. And it's funny, it happens in kind of in the reverse situation because when I was in pro baseball, I asked some guys that I knew about. I had another acquaintance, I would say not a friend, an acquaintance who was at another team. And I said, "Hey, how did you get along with so and so?" And one of the guys' responses was, "He only coaches the good guys." And I was like, "Oh, that's something I don't want to be."
Yeah.
And but it was really good for me to hear, wow, because you forget how observant everybody is, and that everybody is seeing, even though, like you said, you might think like, "Hey, those front seven, these guys, they're the guy we're going to win and lose." Offensive line, defensive line, and especially the service academy. It's going to be really hard to get the size that we need because of the other demands that these guys have. But sometimes you can lose sight of what everybody else's perception, because I used to say to people all the time too, perception is reality. And even though you may think, "Oh, that's not how it is," it doesn't really matter that that's not how you think it is. It matters how the other kids perceive that situation to be.
Yeah.
So I became a really big believer in perception. It's the perception of what we're doing and how we're doing it, and realizing that all of that stuff is really going to make a big difference. And I think in some ways that's right. That gets back to culture. And I always have said, we're the culture creators. That's what we do in athletic programs, is we create culture. We teach kids how to work. We teach kids about accountability. We teach kids lessons that, particularly if they're talented, they may not learn in a practice setting,
Mm.
because coaches a lot of times won't hold talented players to high standards. And I learned very early on that I'm going to hold the most talented kids to the highest standard. And maybe, again, sometimes to my detriment, because sometimes you'd have coaches arguing with you about, "Why are you so hard on so and so?" I'm so hard on him because he's our best player.
Uh,
And because you're not.
Yeah, well, you have to be the countermeasure a lot of times. Sometimes too, like a lot of times I had to be the guy who's like, "You're doing a good job, everybody," which is like not
Yep.
natural in like a strength conditioning. Like, I mean, a lot of times kids are just constantly getting bombarded with how bad they are. So like giving them a pat on the back saying, "At least you're good in here." Like there's that. That was a positive.
Right.
So this is a curveball question. So Vince Gabriel obviously pushing, hey, the semi-private, small private is a big a big influence, right? And I do think a lot about that from just the margins we're working with within a private business and this kind of large group. There's tight margins a lot of times, bigger facilities, managing a lot of people, a lot of coaches, a lot of payroll. And what Vince is like case of, hey, this is maybe a better business model. But with that being said, it definitely feels like it's more rack based. Would you agree with that sentiment based off of the conversation you had with Ant on Strength Coach Podcast?
I would, and I don't love that, and I love Vince. I don't love that system per se. And it was interesting. I don't know why I was writing this down the other day, but I was writing about the fact that, oh, I know what because this year at our spring seminar, I'm going to do kind of a state of the industry talk. And one of the things that I was talking about was the fact that we still have, we're still running a whole bunch of different systems, because we still do one-to-one.
Hmm.
And one of the notes I wrote was that the, uh, the death notice on one-to-one was premature. In terms of one-to-one, it's like 50% of our gross revenue during the course
Hmm.
of the year. And even small group, we still run our small group the same way that we run our athlete group. And so we try to, the biggest difference then is that it's probably less rack based, because the reality is our adults in our group settings, they don't even really, they could go without a rack. We don't do any real rack-based exercise, in the sense that we don't barbell bench press, we don't barbell squat. We do all dumbbell upper body stuff. We don't tend to do chin-ups with our adults, so we don't even really need the chin-up bar, because most of them just don't. I don't think they have the kind of cervical, thoracic, spine health to make chin-ups really beneficial. I don't think most of them have the shoulder health to make barbell bench press beneficial. I know they don't have the low back health to make barbell
Yeah.
squatting beneficial. So I feel like with our adult in our group business, we can push it through the same way. Also for us, I like the the assembly line, because we always talk about the most important 15 minutes are the first 15 minutes, because they're the 15 minutes that nobody does.
Yeah.
So foam rolling, stretching, mobility work, warm up, med ball, plyos. That's all in our first 15 or 20-minute block. And that's the stuff that if we said to people, "Oh, you can just show up 20 minutes into the workout and lift," a large percentage of our clients would do that
Yeah.
and happily do that.
Yeah.
And I just had the conversation with one of my friends the other day. He's one of our former athletes who's now in his 40s. And he comes in and I keep saying, I'm like, "Joe, you're always late." And he's like, "Yeah, I don't like, I kind of skip. I don't come in for the rolling, stretching. I just kind of get here a little bit late and jump into the warm up." And I'm like, "You're missing the most important part. Like you don't get it." And so I still like, I guess in part of it is just, right. That's me. That's who we are. That's how we've
Mhm.
done it. I really like that, whatever we want to call it, assembly line, conveyor belt, waterfall. And I think it's more efficient from a business standpoint. So for us, we have a 5 a.m. group, a 5:15 group, a 5:30 group, a 5:45 group, a 6 o'clock group. We've got 300 small group adults now that run through the facility in groups of, supposed to be 8. We probably sometimes end up at 12, which is
Okay.
another logistical problem that we run
Yeah.
into. But, uh, but we're able to do that really efficiently. 1, because we've got a lot of space,
Mhm.
and 2, because we're constantly moving people out of the next person's way. Your job is, and that's what we tell everybody, every 12 minutes, get out of the way. Know
Okay.
where the next place to be is and be there. And there is no luxury here of hanging out for a few more minutes or doing a little more rolling or stretching a little longer. You got 12 minutes. Move
Now,
on.
you mentioned space. Let's just say hypothetically, MBSE, like, go through a tornado, and you're like, you know what? I'm going to try to find a 1,500 square foot space, and I'm just going to streamline this. Would you keep the assembly line working at a drastically smaller space?
Yep, I think I'd probably, if I had 1,500 square feet, it would probably be, I'd probably be on the 20.
Yeah.
So I'd probably have 5, 520, 540, and 6, and I would work through that way, and I would divide the room up into thirds the same way so that I could continue to do it. I think I would always be trying to figure out logistically how to replicate the system as best I can to continue to do things the way that we've always done them. And here I am, right? A guy who's never never arguing for doing things the way that you've always done them,
Yeah.
arguing
Yeah.
for doing things the way that you've always done them. So I
Yeah.
reserve the right to be a hypocrite at any point during the course of these
I
conversations.
get it. I get it. But it's always that, like, and I trying to challenge myself on this a lot because COVID was a very interesting thing because we did essentially your model because we had to do groups every 15 minutes because we had to consolidate down to one person per rack. And we're not going to be able to get enough people through the door with the restrictions that we had. And then got through a certain period and it was like, we abandoned it because it was like, "Oh, well, let's go back to what we always did." And like about a month back into what we did before, it's like, why did we go back to this? I was like, "Oh, but we could get more people at a given hour, et cetera, or it's just what we're better at, what we're more accustomed to doing, or how we designed a room." And I looked at the data, I was like, okay, we were actually getting more people through when we were doing a like waterfall like fashion. And I was like, had a little scratch my head moment, and we've opened up 2 locations since then. And it always comes at a pivotal moment of like, do we just do what we did before? Why would I do that before, especially if I have a sample that was successful? Uh, I think it's healthy, but it's also we're probably going to regress to some sort of mean of like, well, I'm more accustomed to this. Our training systems, our education, our coaches, everyone just more comfortable with that. And then you start to realize a lot of it is just like the first session that a person's going through, we have a script on how to explain what a session's going to be like. And that kind of influences your decision of like the organization of your weight room and how you structure your classes and going through that. But that definitely comes to the back of my mind, especially at that like devil's advocate moment of like, all right, if I get a 10,000 square foot space tomorrow, or I have to drop down to 500 square foot, what would I do differently and how would I manage that?
Yeah, and like for us, same thing. COVID, for us to stay open, we really had to get to this pod system where everybody had their space and
Hmm.
everybody moved into the next space and okay, you're done at pod 1, wipe it down, move to pod 2. And we kept that. And we're so much better organized now post COVID than we were pre-COVID, because pre-COVID, people just wandered around and kind of, when I look at it now, even though we were doing effectively the same system. Once we said, okay, we're going to have 8 people, one person per rack. Our problem now is that our adults are very used to having their own rack and their own equipment. They don't even like having a second person with them.
I know.
When we get a group of 12 instead of a group of 8 and people have to double up, we're looking and thinking, okay, can we get couples to double up? How are we gonna to do this? Because everybody's used to moving unimpeded through the block. And it was like you alluded to in your podcast. It's that Poliquin style A1, A2, A3 kind of thing. That's how we do everything in terms of
Mhm.
there's 3 things in a block that you're gonna do 3 exercises, and maybe it's a mobility exercise, maybe it's a core exercise, whatever it is. But you're always gonna be 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, move. It's like a little dance in terms of, well, then we're gonna go to the next place, and we're gonna go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, move. And by the time you're done, and like you said, sometimes we do find, hey, this person takes too long. We've got to get them to realize, hey, here's the dance, and
Yeah.
you're not dancing along. We're dancing a waltz, and you're dancing something else. So you got to be you got to keep moving. And we will we talk about the idea. Sometimes the customer suffers for the business, which is not. I always say the customer is always right up until the moment that they're wrong. That's because at some point the customer can't always be right.
Yeah.
There has to be some break point where you realize, all right, I can't let one customer ruin the flow of what we're trying to do, or ruin the vibe, the atmosphere, whatever it is. And
Well,
and
because
we
they're
always
always
say,
thinking selfishly. They're always thinking their own self-serving
oh yeah, absolutely.
rationale, and that's natural, and you appreciate that they wanna make it as good of a possible experience for themselves, but you're effectively making decisions for hundreds of people on every single day, that there's gotta be some sort of compromise of, like, I get you want your own station, or I get you wanna do your own workout in this large group of people, but we have a program that we're doing collectively, and you signed up for group exercise. There is gonna be some sort of, not everything is, like, specific to your wants and needs in this given moment.
Exactly. That's exactly what, and sometimes you have to express that to people, and sometimes you have to let them know that I'll be okay if you
Mhm.
leave. If you decide that you want to be someplace else because we can't meet your needs, then that's all right.
You mentioned before of, like, the walking around, like, who's that random guy just influencing or talking to people? Like, I still get that quite a bit now at the gym, because I work remotely, but I pop in quarterly, and start putting myself in there, and then I'll start, like, asking questions or giving feedback. I'm like, "You know what? I'll run that up to the owner, see what he says, and I don't know." And then it kind of, like, turns around, the coach goes to that person, like, "You know that guy's the guy who's the owner." Like, "Are you fucking kidding me? Like, what a cop out." I'm sorry, yeah, I'll run up to the owner. I don't know what that guy would say. It's such a funny, like, dynamic though, of, like, everyone's first impression when they see someone is, like, just give feedback, like, "Oh, we're doing this," like, not how you doing, just how we can make our product better. And you got your people that are the mayors of the community, feel like they're the spokesperson for the group. And I always get into was this one of those dynamics that was just an absence of disagreement, and you assume that's agreement, that you thought this was the consensus, what everyone felt, like what everyone thinks is the problems with this gym or this program, et cetera, because no one disagreed with you, and you felt like now you're inclined to tell me how to run everything differently to your needs? Like, I'm managing a lot of other people's perspective, and there's always a loud minority effect that, okay, you're speaking on your own behalf and just happen to think it's the voice of the people. Thank you for that, and, I'll run it up to the owner here really quickly, see what he says. Okay, so I got one more question here, and I think this will be very, very, interesting to hear your take on. Uh, Obviously, you're probably one of the bigger influences on the utilitarian, utility of, like, a certain piece, like a rack or a dumbbell or Kaiser functional column, because we can do ground-based, multi-planar, et cetera. It kinda comes at the expense of certain standardized machines or isolated joint action. You mentioned a lot with the private training, how they just kind of integrate into the group exercise. One thing that I found with private training is machines are pretty impactful for the person that can't do the standard program that we have. Do you find with the waterfall, like type of style, and everyone kind of having to adapt to that flow, that there are definitive spots that you're like, that would be where I would put a standardized machine for that person? Or is it, no, I can get as much out of these ground-based things as I could with any machine?
I feel like I could get as much out of these and more actually when I think you get better with creativity and with attachments and looking and thinking. So for instance, we have this, it's called an AT400 because a guy named Alan Thomas, who was a strength coach for the White Sox, developed it. But it's basically just allows you to standing cable press with 2 arms or standing cable row with 2 arms off of a single pulley column. And we use these things all the time because there's it's like you can make your Kaiser into almost any machine that you want it
Got
to be just by having the right handles. So I think sometimes and it's interesting, I think sometimes people cop out a little bit in terms of saying, "Hey, this would be way better if I had a machine."
Mhm.
And 2, I think it's becoming fashionable because nobody has machines anymore
Yeah.
to say, "Oh, it would be great to have machines." And I see a certain regressiveness in the field sometimes where you see a lot of people going back to bodybuilding type splits.
Mhm.
And a lot of people saying, "Oh, I would love to have a pendulum squat, and I would love to have a belt squat, and I would love to have." And I look and think, I mean, I kinda like, I guess I would. But if I looked at it and said, in the grand scheme of things, is it really gonna move the needle? I think the answer would probably be no. Maybe there'd be 1 or 2 people who would really significantly benefit from that. But I always looked at it as, do I wanna give up between 16 and 32 square feet for that particular exercise, be it a row or a squat or whatever it is, when there's just so many things that I could do
Mm.
in standing. And I think part of that comes back to kind of the functional thing. It's always the machine is always I always say the machine is the definition of not functional in terms
Mhm.
of stability. You're seated, generally speaking, the stability is being supplied by a couple of steel rods. And so I think you're giving up a lot to gain a little. And so generally, like I said, we have the Kaiser pieces are great. The Kaiser functional trainers really are almost limiting you to what your mind can envision.
Yeah.
We have a couple of MVP shuttles, which I really believe that because it gives you kind of a leg press for that maybe real beginner, total knee replacement, whatever it is. Somebody like that just isn't going to be able to handle even a reasonable percentage of their body weight. But beyond that, we don't have anything. That's it.
Would you consider some of the bikes that you have like a cyclical action, just like that, of like, hey, this is a targeted energy system, and doing running or shuttles with adult Gen Pop would be a challenge. And that would be one of those, I guess, um, exceptions.
Yes, I would say that's the biggest exception. I mean, I'm a huge air bike fan.
Hmm.
I was an early Airdyne adopter. I love the idea because we've done so much of it. You realize that you get better VO2 max increases, higher heart rate, everything. I sometimes think people haven't studied that bike enough. Like I look at it and think you should be doing your testing even in a hospital setting on dual action bikes because you're so limited by like your legs crapping out
Hmm.
on a regular bike.
Yeah.
Whereas on a dual action bike, you're just getting way more. You're doing what you would be doing in real life. You're supplying blood to all 4 limbs, and you're doing it in an impactless situation, and with the air bike, you're doing it in an accommodating resistance setting where all you have to say to somebody is, "Just want it to be harder, give them a higher RPM number." It is so dumbed down and so perfect that, yeah, I'd say 60 to 70% of our conditioning are done on the bikes.
Yeah.
There are some people who wanna, like you said, they wanna run tempos or they wanna do some stuff, and if you're really kind of set in your ways and you wanna push a sled and you wanna run some tempos and you wanna do that, we won't fight you to the death for it.
Hmm.
But if you have any injury history at all, if you're somebody who's had any history of whatever, plantar fascia or Achilles or knee pain or whatever, then we are gonna fight you tooth and nail to get you on the bike. The good thing about getting people on the bike is they're in a hurry to get off,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Well,
they don't get overused.
it's such an interesting thing because I work with predominantly adult Gen Pop now, and it's aesthetics. Like they just, if you ask them definitively what they want, like they'll never really give you a straight answer, but it'll always eventually settle on, if I just look better, I'm going to be happy. And then you look at, all right, if you show me your weight room, I can tell you your philosophy, type of mentality. It's racks, it's bars, it's dumbbells, it's trap bars, it's some med balls, it's some kettlebells. And you're like, all right, that's it. And we're going to funnel them into your kind of like your influence on me was a push pull, hinge and squat. And we're going to do it in a vertical horizontal. We're going to do it a bilateral, unilateral, hip dominant, knee dominant. And that's it, right? That's the big four broken up into two subcategories, 3 days a week. And then you go, okay, like you're going to do that with progressive overload, but they're not going to change any of their diet. We're never going to get any energy system work. And we're going to hit some sort of like threshold of if they're not good at the exercise, they'll never really push hard enough to get something from that exercise. So it's that like feeling of, okay, if I have an assault bike, I can get them on there or an echo bike and tell them just go as hard as humanly possible, raise that heart rate to a level that's going to create some sort of cardiovascular adaptation, but also just push in a safe and like really controlled environment. It just raises that perception of like that's the effort it's going to take to change your body comp. Just for a record, it's hard to do that with free weight things. And I attribute that, kind of bleed that over to okay, if a person is like definitive, I have a timeline or a very specific goal, sometimes machines really allow me to get that person in that because it's usually a mental block. And I always tell our coaches either they can't or they won't. They can't do it from some sort of biomechanic thing that they just don't have the pattern and they're not going to get the value from that pattern they were trying to do, or they just won't. There's a psychological block. They just stop before it gets hard, or they just don't have discipline and they won't comply with what we're asking them to do. Figure out which one it is and then find the tool, whether it's free weight or machine based or cardiovascular tool that's going to get the job done. If we don't have it, let's have a conversation of how we're going to get it or where we're going to put it and where we're going to insert that into the program. But there's always this like, I know the ceiling of a push, pull, hinge, and squat with the two subcategories, 3 days a week. And if it gets to that, I want to lose 10% body fat, or if I want to reach a specific goal in a certain timeline, which is, like it's so hard to like tell them it's most of that's going to be on you. 90% of that's going to be what you do in the 23 hours that you're not here. But with that being said, is the expectations there? So that's always I want to get to I got a prone leg curl because I know that I'm just not getting enough stress in the hamstring and the posterior chain from doing slide leg curl and foam roll leg curl and physio ball leg curl. And most of my people can't do Nordics or glute hams. And like, all right, like probably get a leg curl in there just to teach them, hey, this is the tension you should feel there. And then hopefully it can get them to doing Nordics more effectively down the road or lat pull down, something of that. Because pull up wise, it's either I can or I can't. And I can do eccentrics, I can do inverted rows, I can do dumbbell rows. They just never seem to cross that threshold. And let me do a lat pull down to teach them how to progressively overload this to get them closer to that. But it takes up space and it takes up time. And a lot of times we'll have a bottleneck effect of we have everyone just trying to go to that option. You're like, all right, now we're struggling to manage this because we have 6 people over at that one lat pull down and we're losing them in that. So there's always a trade-off in a lot of
Right,
ways.
and that's for us, that's why we didn't do it, because one of the things I realize, and I always talk to our coaches about the slippery slope idea, as soon as you make the exception for somebody,
Mhm.
everybody wants to be the exception,
Yeah.
and when you can go over there and use that, you can use the machine instead. Like you said, next thing you know, you've got a line of people at the machine,
Yeah.
and then the people are complaining to you that you don't have enough
Yeah. Yeah.
of
Yeah, we've
and
always the
then
one
you're back.
pushback we get is we don't have enough dumbbells under 10 pounds. I'm like, "No, we don't have enough people who can lift over 10 pounds." That's the issue on my end.
Well, that's one thing we realize we have tons. We have, and obviously we have them by 2.5s,
Mhm.
and we've gotten multiple sets. I think up to 22.5, 25. There's probably at least 3, if not 4 sets of most of those in there. Because again, that's the stuff, but that's from a business standpoint, that's the stuff that you do wanna listen to. I tell our coaches all the time, "If it costs less than $100, bring it to me right away,
Mhm.
and I'll probably get it for you.
Yeah.
If it costs more than $1,000, bring it up, and I'll think about it."
Yeah.
And it's been a pretty good way to define for our coaches how we continue to sort of develop the facility in a responsible way. Like, it would be great, people are talking about VBT. Well, yeah, VBT is a great idea if I wanna go and plunk down $2,000 per unit for the VBT unit and then get an iPad to put on every rack and an attachment, and then get it all connected to Wi-Fi and then do it, but I'm not spending 16, 18, $20,000 to get VBT in there because that's the business's money. That's not
Yeah.
the US Army's money or
Mhm.
Boston University's money. It's a lot easier to spend that money than it is to spend your own.
Yeah, I mean, we do VBT, one, because we still do a lot of barbell-oriented stuff with a select group, but what we found is when it breaks down, it's a pretty big hit to the program, and, one of the big reasons, Mike, we did it was because we'll have a lot of young coaches working with a lot of adult very confident, very successful people. And the joke is like, if they can afford a membership here, that means they're probably smart enough to figure out what we're doing and do it as well as we could ever do. So your value prop is just knowing the program a little bit better than them, giving them some insight on how to be successful in every single day. And where VBT really came in is like, all right, if it's too slow, it's too heavy. If it's too light, if it's too fast, it's too light. Like, and giving them a smaller window to work within just to help the coaches that are maybe 20 years the junior of a guy who's wildly successful. Like, don't tell me 20-year-old. Like, I didn't tell you, the velocity did. But when it breaks down, it's pretty bad for the overall business because it's like a couple week process or just the training process of teaching all these coaches how to go through this stuff and just more stuff to work through. And, it's drinking through a fire hose a lot of times and what pressure is privilege for our coaches. But there's a streamlined effect of like, how much value is this going to bring? And if it goes down, what is our contingency? And yeah, we get exposed on that quite a bit. And it was a big investment. I agree. Like that was a
Yeah,
part,
it's big. That's the biggest thing for me is it's a big investment.
Yeah. Yeah. But that was always the managing what is going to be the biggest weak spot we have. And we're having young entry level coaches working with hyper successful people that we get to that window where they're breaking down the workout. The ones that are start to work out while you're talking, those are the ones that like you got to win over by just being really good coach, being consistent every single day, bringing value to that person, whether they believe you are that person or not, but you got to win them. And they're
Yeah,
not going to come here long term if they don't think they're getting value from you as a coach.
and they're not gonna I always think that was my big, kind of positive takeaway from CrossFit, is just that connection, community, peace. People are coming for that,
Yeah.
and that's your coaches, that's not your programming, and it's not your facility, it's the personalities that we always say we hire for personality.
Yeah.
My standard line is, "I can make you smarter, I can't make you nicer." I
Yeah.
probably can't change your personality, but if you pay attention in the staff meetings and you stay awake and you stay off your phone, you're probably gonna start to get a better grasp of what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Mike, this was great, man. It was an unbelievable conversation. Really appreciate you reaching out, one, and thank you for that. And obviously, I mean, will plug whatever I got to plug for you, but everyone knows how to find you. And you're huge on Twitter, man. I mean, I always joke with everyone. I'm like, you got a question, Mike's probably going to answer it. So just put it out there, and you got
Well,
one of
so
the best
whether
resources.
whether you want me to or not, I
Yeah,
probably will.
it's great.
It's funny, but it's I have twice as many Instagram followers, but I spend way more time on Twitter because I love um, that method of interacting. It's very easy to go back and forth, and I think I've been on since 2008 or 2010 or something like that. I was at a seminar and someone said, "You should get on Twitter, it's gonna be a big deal," and I just was at the seminar and I just typed it in and joined, but I really do like it, and I do think it's like this, like podcasting, whatever, it's adapting to the way that education is going to be perceived or created, and this is where people are learning, this is where people are going to learn, and what I've realized now is that sometimes you have to disagree with people on there because there's people who don't know what the hell they're talking about, who people think do know what the hell they're talking about because of the frequency with which they post.
Yeah. And it has a huge influence on your athletes. Like they do. They see it. They're all over it. And one thing that I learned pretty quickly with social media was I need to be ahead of this eventual conversation I'm going to have with my client or athlete. And I can't be blindsided. And if don't have a rebuttal, if I don't have something to give some sort of consideration of why we're doing something, relatively speaking, to some just person just spewing stuff with no real context or just speaking hypotheticals really, uh, I'm gonna look bad. And I always hated that feeling. So you're constantly like, I find myself on Twitter and social media because of that. Like, I don't want to be caught with my pants down and saying I don't have a good answer for. Like, I don't want to be like this. I know everything kind of guy, but I definitely don't want to feel dumb in a situation where my clients like, "What you see what such and such had?" And that
Right.
part is,
Yes, exactly. And that's where you realize that that's also where your kids are consuming their information. I have guys bringing me stuff. I mean, CBum is the perfect example. I don't even know who the guy is, but someone would come to me and say, "Oh, CBum says this is what you're supposed to do." And I remember looking, thinking, "Who the hell is that? Like, who is this person?"
yeah,
And but if you're not paying attention to social media, you completely miss out on the fact that there are influencers out there that we're completely unaware of,
yeah, yeah.
and they're having a massive effect while we're having a minimal effect.
I know, I know. And to be completely fair, one of those guys is probably appropriating a lot of other people's like hard work. And I think the day of reckoning is, and I tweeted about the other day, which you commented on, like if I see another talking head video, just taking someone else's workout and giving your approval or your disapproval, like don't like it just one, I don't want to be without above reproach. And if you have like a great if you say, "Hey Tim, I don't agree with that," like, all right, like I'll stop and have a conversation with it. But if a rando out there is just trying to essentially plagiarize our work and saying this is good training, like I don't appreciate that in a lot of ways because it's just appropriating someone else's work, like Charlie Francis, et cetera. Like that part to me is driving me nuts. But there's a notion of that kid who's watching that person giving their approval to someone else's program thinks the person giving their approval is the one who came up with it. And I think that's where it's like, no, we got to go through layers of this of, hey, go back through all the way back to like your first book or Stronger Shall Survive or like Poliquin Principles or some stuff that even like Ian King, who we talked about on Twitter one day was like, these guys are out there and they're just kind of lying in the wake because they're not on social media or doing stuff. And Charles passed, obviously, but like I find some young people are just getting the several like copies or iterations of stuff that's been done 30, 40 years ago and not really doing the due diligence of why we maybe evolved from that and why we've like not done that as in a long time because it got a lot of people hurt or got a lot of people worse or there's just more efficient ways to do things.
Exactly.
Um, well, this is great.
100%.
Yeah.
No, thank you very much. No, this was great.
Yeah.
Just to get a chance to talk to you for an hour was well worth it.
I appreciate it. All right. Well, you guys find Mike, get on there and we'll go from there.
All right. Let me know when it's out.
I will. All right. Mm.